He thought he could leave with his mistress and find Layla waiting. But when her millionaire husband came back, she was gone, and she didn't say a word. It was 4 a.m. on a Thursday in December. The Manhattan penthouse was silent, except for the soft rustle of Dominic Ashford folding his cashmere sweaters into a Louis Vuitton duffel. Layla stood in the doorway of their bedroom, 6 months pregnant, arms crossed over her belly, watching him prepare for what he called an investor meeting in Aspen. She knew Vanessa Crane would be on that trip. She'd seen the texts, she'd smelled the perfume on his collar for months. She knew everything. Dominic zipped the bag and finally looked at her. He crossed the room, pressed a kiss to her forehead, the kind of kiss you give a pet you're about to leave at a kennel, and told her he'd be back in 5 days. His hand didn't touch her belly. His eyes didn't linger. He walked out without looking back. Layla listened to the elevator doors close. She moved to the window and watched his black Escalade pull away from the building, its taillights disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness of Fifth Avenue. She counted to 60, then to 100. Then she picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in 4 years. Her father answered on the second ring. His voice was tired, cautious, still carrying the hurt of their estrangement. She could hear him sitting up in bed, could imagine him reaching for his glasses, checking the caller ID twice to make sure he wasn't dreaming. She took a breath and said the words that would change everything. "Dad, I'm coming home, and I'm bringing everything." 4 years earlier, Layla Mercer was 24 years old with an architecture degree from Columbia and a small firm she'd just started in Boston. She had 3 employees, a cramped office above a Thai restaurant, and more ambition than clients. The walls were covered with blueprints she'd drawn herself. The coffee machine was always broken. The heating barely worked in winter. But she was building something. Every late night, every rejected proposal, every small victory felt like laying bricks for a future she could see clearly. Her father, Henry Mercer, had taught her that. He'd built Mercer Construction from a single truck and a dream into one of the most respected development companies on the East Coast. He'd started pouring concrete at 19. By 40, he owned a fleet of equipment. By 55, he was bidding on projects worth hundreds of millions. He believed in earning things, in patience, in integrity, in showing up every day and doing the work even when no one was watching. Layla believed in those things too, until she met Dominic Ashford. It happened at an architecture awards ceremony in Boston. Layla wasn't nominated, she was just there to network, handing out business cards that still smelled like the print shop. She was standing by the bar when a man in a charcoal Tom Ford suit appeared beside her. Dominic Ashford, 15 years older, salt and pepper hair, the kind of confidence that suggested he'd never been told no in his life. He owned one of the largest real estate development firms in New York, hotels in Dubai, condominiums in Miami, shopping centers across 3 continents. He was the kind of man her father competed against, the kind who usually won. That night, he asked about her work. He listened like every word mattered. He made her feel like the most important person in the room. Within a week, he was sending flowers daily. Within a month, he'd flown her to Paris. Within 3 months, she was convinced he saw something in her that no one else had. What she didn't see was the pattern, the same moves he'd used on other women, the same intensity that felt like love but was really acquisition. Dominic Ashford didn't fall in love, he identified targets. When she told her father about him, the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. They were sitting in his study in Charleston, the room where he'd taught her to read blueprints when she was 8 years old. The walls were lined with photos of projects he'd completed, schools, hospitals, office buildings, all built with Mercer quality. He set down his coffee and looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Layla, he said slowly, I know this man. I know him better than you think. He leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. 3 years ago, Dominic Ashford destroyed a deal I'd been building for 18 months, a waterfront development in Miami worth $40 million. I had the contract, I had the city council's support, I had broken ground. His voice got quieter. He bribed city officials. He leaked false information about our company's finances to the press. He fabricated safety violations that triggered investigations. By the time I cleared my name, he'd stolen the contract from under me. I nearly lost everything. He paused, and she saw something she'd never seen in her father's eyes. Exhaustion, old pain. Your mother's medical bills had already drained our savings. That Miami deal was supposed to be our recovery. I spent 2 years climbing out of that hole, Layla. 2 years of 16-hour days and canceled vacations and loans I'm still paying off. I never told you because I didn't want you to worry. But, sweetheart, this man is dangerous. He reached across and took her hands. He doesn't love, he acquires, he collects things, properties, companies, people, and when he's done with them, he discards them. I've seen it happen to business partners, to employees, to wives. Please, I'm begging you, don't do this. But Dominic had already planted seeds in her mind. Over the previous weeks, he'd mentioned casually that Henry Mercer's company had struggled because of poor decisions, that her father was known in some circles as a man who couldn't compete with the real players, that the Miami deal fell apart because Mercer Construction had cut corners and gotten caught. He'd suggested, gently, that perhaps Henry was jealous of their relationship, that her father couldn't stand to see his daughter succeed beyond his reach, that this was really about control. Layla had believed him. She'd wanted to believe him, because the alternative meant admitting she'd fallen for a monster. She chose Dominic. She chose the fairy tale over her father's truth.
Within 6 months, she'd closed her firm, moved into his penthouse, and stopped returning her father's calls. She told herself she was building a bigger future. She told herself love required sacrifice. She told herself her father would understand eventually. She didn't know it yet, but her father had kept every document from that Miami deal, every email, every wire transfer, every piece of evidence of what Dominic had done. He'd stored it in a safe deposit box and never told anyone. He was just waiting for her to ask. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10 at the end. Now, let's continue. The first year of marriage felt like a dream wrapped in silk. Layla had a closet the size of her old apartment, filled with designer clothes Dominic picked out for her: Chanel, Valentino, Oscar de la Renta. She had a personal assistant named Elena who scheduled her days with spa appointments, charity lunches, and gallery openings. She had a housekeeper named Rosa who arrived at 7 every morning and didn't leave until the penthouse gleamed. She had everything except herself. It started so small she didn't notice at first. Dominic would introduce her at parties as his beautiful architect wife. She'd smile, extend her hand, wait for the follow-up questions about her work. But whenever she tried to discuss actual architecture, a building she admired, a design philosophy she'd studied, an idea she wanted to explore, Dominic would steer the conversation elsewhere. At a dinner party in the Hamptons, she found herself seated next to a man who developed sustainable housing projects in Vermont. He was genuinely interested in her background, asking thoughtful questions about Columbia's program and her thesis on adaptive reuse. Layla started explaining her ideas about converting abandoned industrial buildings into affordable housing.
She could feel herself coming alive, remembering who she'd been before the penthouse, before the designer clothes, before she'd become Mrs. Dominic Ashford. Then Dominic's hand found her knee under the table. He squeezed, hard enough to leave a bruise that would purple by morning.
She stopped mid-sentence. Dominic laughed, that charming, disarming laugh that made everyone adore him, and addressed the table with an apologetic smile. Layla's adorable when she talks about her little hobby, but let's discuss something more interesting. Did anyone catch the Knicks game last night? The conversation shifted. The man from Vermont gave her a puzzled look, but didn't press. Everyone else seemed to forget she'd been speaking at all. The humiliation burned through her chest. She wanted to stand up, to correct him, to announce that architecture wasn't a hobby, but a profession she'd trained for years to master. Instead, she smiled. She stayed silent. She picked up her wine glass with steady hands and pretended everything was fine. Later that night, when she tried to talk about what had happened, Dominic sighed like she was an exhausting child. "Baby, I was protecting you. You were boring that poor man to death. Nobody at these dinners wants to hear about building codes and zoning regulations. They want to relax, have fun. You need to learn how to read a room." But He placed a finger on her lips. "You're too smart to waste your time on blueprints, baby. Let me handle the business side of things. You focus on being happy, on being beautiful, on being the incredible woman I married. That's what you're good at." She wanted to argue. She wanted to remind him that she had a degree, a vision, a career she'd sacrificed for him. But his voice was so gentle, so certain, and a small part of her, a part that would grow larger every day, wondered if maybe he was right. Maybe her ambitions were just hobbies. Maybe her real value was in supporting his success. That was the first crack in who she used to be. By the second year, the cracks had become canyons. Layla proposed designing their beach house in the Hamptons. It would be a small project, something just for them, a way to use her skills without competing with his business. She spent 3 weeks on the blueprints, pouring her heart into every line, every angle, every carefully considered detail. The design was modern but warm, floor-to-ceiling windows facing the ocean, sustainable materials, a rooftop garden, a studio space where she could work while listening to the waves. She presented it to Dominic over dinner, her heart pounding like a student defending her thesis. He looked at the blueprints for maybe 30 seconds. He didn't ask questions. He didn't comment on specific choices. He just nodded, set them aside, and told her he'd already hired someone else, a more experienced architect, a man named Gerald, whose work he trusted, someone with a real portfolio. The words hit her like a slap. She found out later that Gerald was a man who owed Dominic favors, something about a bankruptcy Dominic had helped him avoid. The design he produced was mediocre, uninspired, a generic beach house that could have been copied from any luxury real estate magazine. White walls, glass railings, the same layout every wealthy buyer on the East Coast had seen 100 times. But Dominic praised it publicly at the opening party. He called Gerald a visionary. He posed for photos with his arm around the architect, both of them beaming at cameras while waiters circulated with champagne. At one point during the party, a guest asked Layla what she thought of the design. She'd opened her mouth to answer when Dominic appeared beside her, his hand on her lower back, pressing just a little too firmly. "Layla's not really a beach house person," he said smoothly. "She prefers the city, don't you, darling?" She smiled and agreed. What else could she do? He never mentioned her proposal, not to the guests, not to the press, not even to her in private. It was as if those 3 weeks of work had never happened,
as if her ideas, her expertise, her entire professional identity had simply ceased to exist. That night, after the last guest left, she found her blueprints in the trash. Not crumpled up in anger, that might have meant he'd felt something when he discarded them, just folded neatly and placed in the bin, like old newspapers or expired coupons. She didn't fish them out. She didn't confront him. She went to bed and stared at the ceiling until dawn. But something had shifted, a tiny crack she wouldn't recognize until much later, the first fracture in her faith that things would get better. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that this was only the beginning. The beach house rejection was a test, and she had passed it by staying silent, by swallowing her humiliation, by proving she could be controlled. Now he knew exactly how far he could push. The financial control came next, and it was surgical in its precision. Layla discovered one morning that her credit cards had been canceled. She was at Bergdorf's buying a birthday gift for her brother. She still sent gifts, even though they barely spoke, when the transaction was declined. The saleswoman's expression shifted from warmth to pity. Layla's face burned as she mumbled something about a bank error and fled the store. When she called the bank, they informed her that her name wasn't on any accounts. Everything, the checking accounts, the savings accounts, the credit lines, the investments, was in Dominic's name alone. The cards she'd been using were authorized user cards, and the authorization had been revoked. She confronted him that evening, trying to keep her voice level. He didn't deny it. He didn't even seem concerned. "Why would you need your own accounts, baby? Everything's taken care of. The staff handles the house, the drivers handle transportation, I handle the bills. You don't need to worry about money. That's my job." "But what if I want to buy something? What if I need?" He pulled out his wallet and handed her a black American Express card. "This is yours. There's no limit. Buy whatever you want. Just send the statements to my accountant so we can track expenses for taxes." She took the card. It felt like a collar. She mentioned it once more, carefully, diplomatically, a few weeks later. Maybe she could have a small account of her own, just for personal expenses, just for independence. Dominic's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes.
Is there something you're not telling me? Some reason you need money I can't see? Are you planning something? No, because if there's a problem in our marriage, Layla, I'd rather you tell me directly than watch you squirrel away funds behind my back. That's what my first wife did, right before she tried to take half of everything I'd built. She didn't know he'd been married before. He'd never mentioned it. She stopped asking about money. A few weeks later, she needed to send a birthday card to her brother, just a card with a check inside, something she'd done every year since Ryan turned 18. She asked Dominic for the checkbook. He looked at her like she'd asked for the nuclear codes. "Why do you need to write a check? It's Ryan's birthday. I always send him." "I'll have Elena take care of it. Just tell her the amount." "I'd rather do it myself. It's personal." Dominic set down his newspaper and studied her with an expression she was learning to dread. The clinical assessment. The calculation. "Is there a reason you need direct access to our accounts, Layla? Something you're not telling me?" "No, because this feels like the start of something. First, it's a check for your brother. Then it's a check for an old friend. Then it's cash you're squirreling away somewhere I can't see. And before you know it, we have a situation." She didn't know what situation meant. She was afraid to ask. She told Elena to send Ryan a check for $500. She didn't sign it. She didn't choose the card. She didn't even know if Elena included a personal note or just a generic happy birthday from the Ashfords. That was the last birthday gift she sent to anyone. The worst part, she was starting to forget who she'd been before him. The woman who'd stayed up until 3 a.m. perfecting blueprints. The woman who'd argued with contractors and won. The woman who'd believed she could build something that mattered. That woman was disappearing, and Layla wasn't sure she could get her back.
The isolation happened so gradually she barely noticed until it was complete. Her old friends from architecture school stopped calling because she never called them back. Every time she tried to schedule lunch or coffee, Dominic had something planned. A charity event she needed to attend, a dinner with investors where her presence was required, a trip to somewhere beautiful that happened to coincide exactly with her friend's visit. Elena, the assistant, managed her calendar with ruthless efficiency. She would apologetically explain that Mrs. Ashford wasn't available, that her schedule was simply too full, that perhaps they could try again next month. Next month never came. Her phone was monitored. She realized this when Dominic mentioned a conversation she'd had with a former colleague. Specific details, direct quotes, things he couldn't have known unless he'd been listening. When she confronted him, he acted confused, then concerned. "I'm just trying to protect you, baby. There are people who would use you to get to me. Competitors, journalists, women who want what you have. I need to know who you're talking to. It's for your own safety." The staff reported everything. Rosa, the housekeeper, would casually mention to Dominic what Layla had done that day, who she'd seen, what she'd ordered for lunch, how long she'd spent in which room. Elena scheduled Layla's entire life and sent copies to Dominic's office every evening. She was surrounded by people and utterly alone. Every support system she'd ever had was gone. Every escape route was blocked. Every piece of her old life had been carefully, systematically erased. And the cage was so beautiful, she'd almost stopped noticing the bars. But she told herself this was normal. This was what wealthy couples did. This was the price of the life she'd chosen. Other women would kill for her problems. Then she got pregnant, and everything changed. She'd imagined this moment for months. She pictured telling Dominic over a romantic dinner, watching his face light up with joy. She imagined him placing his hand on her belly, talking about names and nurseries and the family they would build together. She thought a child would change things, would soften him, would give them something to love that wasn't about power or status or control. She told him on a Tuesday evening in the living room of their penthouse, the Manhattan skyline glittering behind them like a promise. His face didn't light up. It went cold. He set down his scotch with deliberate precision and asked the question that shattered something inside her. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" She didn't understand at first. She thought he was asking if she was certain about the pregnancy itself, if she'd taken enough tests, if she'd seen a doctor, if it might be a false positive. But that wasn't what he meant at all. "I have the Tokyo expansion launching in the spring," he continued, his voice flat, businesslike. "The Dubai investors are coming next month. I need you available for these events, Layla. Presentable, not hormonal and exhausted and showing." Presentable. He'd used that word like pregnancy was a flaw, like the life growing inside her was an inconvenience to his social calendar. She told him she was keeping the baby. Her voice didn't waver. It wasn't a discussion. Something shifted in his eyes, a hardness she'd glimpsed before but never fully acknowledged. He nodded slowly, finished his scotch, and walked out of the room without another word. The distance that followed was calculated cruelty. He started coming home later, midnight, 2 a.m., sometimes not at all. His shirts smelled different, a perfume that wasn't hers, something floral and expensive, something that clung to the fabric even after Rosa laundered them. He made no effort to hide it. She found the first real evidence on a Sunday morning. His phone was on the nightstand, buzzing with a message he'd forgotten to silence. He was in the shower. She knew she shouldn't look. She looked anyway. The name on the screen was Vanessa. The message read, "Miss you already. Last night was perfect. Can't rate for Aspen."
Layla's hands were steady as she read it. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't throw the phone against the wall like she wanted to. She set it back exactly where she'd found it, matching the angle precisely. Then she walked to the guest bathroom, farther from the shower, less likely to be heard, and gripped the marble counter until her knuckles went white. Her reflection stared back at her, a woman she barely recognized, thinner than she'd been 4 years ago, paler, with shadows under her eyes that no amount of expensive concealer could hide. "Who are you?" she asked the mirror. "What happened to you?" The woman in the mirror had no answers. She spent the next 3 days watching, gathering evidence, noting the times his phone buzzed with messages he stepped away to read, cataloging the nights he came home late with that particular smell clinging to his clothes. She wasn't crazy, she wasn't paranoid, she wasn't hormonal. She was right. She confronted him on a Thursday evening. She waited until after dinner, until he'd had his scotch and seemed relaxed, until she could be certain her voice wouldn't break. She didn't accuse, she didn't cry. She simply asked the question, direct and flat. "Is Vanessa Crane your mistress?" Dominic looked up from his laptop with an expression of mild annoyance, the same expression he used when the housekeeper interrupted his calls, the same expression he used when Layla asked about finances or friends or anything that suggested she had thoughts of her own. "Don't be dramatic, Layla." "I'm not being dramatic. I'm asking a direct question. I saw the message on your phone." He set down his fork and knife with careful precision. He dabbed his mouth with the napkin. He took his time. "What does it matter? You know how I operate. You've known for years. Men like me have needs. It doesn't mean I don't love you. It means I'm human." He said it so casually, so matter-of-factly, like infidelity was a business expense she should have anticipated and budgeted for.
She asked why. Why Vanessa? Why now? Why when she was carrying his child? He smiled, the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Vanessa understands me. She's ambitious, hungry. She doesn't need constant reassurance or emotional maintenance. She's useful." Useful. That was the word that broke something inside her. Layla realized in that moment that she had never been a wife to him. She'd been an asset, a beautiful accessory to display at parties, to soften his image, to signal that the ruthless businessman was also a family man. And now that she was pregnant, difficult, demanding attention, she'd become a liability. The other woman wasn't just his lover, she was his weapon. Layla almost gave up. For 2 weeks after the confrontation, she moved through the penthouse like a ghost. She ate when Rosa reminded her to eat. She slept when exhaustion overtook her. She attended the prenatal appointments alone because Dominic always had something more important, a meeting, a call, a trip, anything but this. She stood in the nursery she'd been decorating and couldn't remember why she'd chosen yellow. She couldn't remember choosing anything. The decisions felt like they'd been made by someone else, some earlier version of herself who'd still believed in the future. She considered her options and found none. She had no money of her own. Her name wasn't on any accounts, any properties, any investments. Her architecture career was 4 years dead. Her license had lapsed. Her contacts had dried up. Her portfolio consisted of one beach house design that had been thrown in the trash. Her father probably wouldn't take her calls. She'd tried once in a moment of desperation late at night, and the phone had rung until voicemail. She'd hung up without leaving a message. She couldn't even be sure he'd want her back after the way she'd chosen Dominic over him, after the things she'd said. The penthouse was a golden cage, and she had swallowed the key herself. She'd done this. Every choice that had led here was her own. One night, Dominic came home in an unusually good mood. He brought flowers. Pink peonies, her favorite, the first flowers in over a year. He brought takeout from the Italian place she loved. He sat with her on the couch, his hand on her belly, feeling the baby kick. He told her about a new deal, the biggest project of his career, a $200 million development contract in Atlanta, mixed use, waterfront, the kind of landmark project that would cement his legacy. Forbes was already calling about a cover story. He poured champagne for himself and sparkling water for her, and he told her this would change everything. After this deal closed, he'd slow down, be more present, be the husband and father she deserved. Maybe they'd even take a real vacation, somewhere with a beach, somewhere they could just be together. She looked at his face and saw the man she'd fallen in love with at that bar in Boston. Charming, attentive, seemingly sincere. She almost believed him. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, smiled, that private smile, the one she knew now wasn't for her, and excused himself to take the call in his study. She heard him laugh through the closed door, a different laugh, lighter, warmer, the laugh he used with Vanessa. Something inside her calcified. She wasn't going to wait for him to change. He wasn't going to change. The flowers, the champagne, the promises, they were just new chains dressed up as gifts, a different kind of cage, but a cage nonetheless. 2 nights later, Dominic announced his trip to Aspen. 5 days with investors, he said, critical meetings, high-stakes negotiations. The Atlanta project required his full attention. He needed to focus. Layla nodded and asked if he needed her to pack anything special, a particular tie, his lucky cufflinks. He looked surprised, then pleased. He kissed her cheek and said she was being so understanding lately, so mature. Maybe the pregnancy was good for her after all. She smiled and said nothing. After he went to bed, she crept to his study. The room was supposed to be locked. He'd installed a keypad after she'd questioned him about Vanessa. But she'd memorized the code months ago, watching his fingers from the reflection in the window. He thought she never paid attention. He was wrong. The door swung open silently. His desk was meticulous, organized with the precision of a man who trusted no one. Files labeled and alphabetized, documents in neat stacks. A computer she didn't have the password to, but that didn't matter. The paper files told her everything. The Atlanta project, $200 million. Her father's company was one of the 3 finalists. But these documents showed the real plan. Dominic was going to cheat, again. She found emails where he discussed bribing city officials, bank records showing payments to offshore accounts, a step-by-step plan to destroy her father's bid with fake safety violations and planted evidence. And everywhere, in every file, on every memo, one name kept appearing: Vanessa Crane. She wasn't just his mistress, she was his partner in crime, the one who made the bribes look legal, the one who drafted fake documents and coordinated payments. And she'd done it before. Layla photographed every page. Her hands didn't shake, her heart didn't race. She felt something she hadn't felt in years. Clarity. He thought she was broken. He was about to find out how wrong he was. The next 5 days were a master class in patience. Layla became the perfect wife again. She smiled, she cooked breakfast, she asked about his meetings and nodded at his answers. She kissed Dominic goodbye at the door when his car arrived for the airport, telling him she'd miss him, telling him to dress warm, telling him she loved him. He looked almost suspicious at first, then pleased, then dismissive. The old Layla was back, he probably thought, the compliant one, the broken one. He didn't know that the old Layla was dead. He didn't know what had replaced her. The moment his Escalade turned the corner, she got to work. The first call was the hardest. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her father's number on the burner phone Ryan had shipped to a mailbox rental place in Brooklyn. 4 years of silence. 4 years of choosing the wrong man over the only one who'd ever truly protected her. 4 years of holidays missed, birthdays ignored, bridges burned. Her thumb hovered over the screen for a long time. Then she pressed call. He answered on the second ring. Layla. His voice cracked on her name. Just that, just her name, and she was crying. She told him everything. The control, the isolation, the monitoring, the affairs, the pregnancy, the corruption she'd discovered, the plot against his company. She told him she was sorry. She told him she'd been wrong. She told him she understood if he couldn't forgive her. He was quiet for a long moment after she finished. She could hear him breathing. She braced herself for anger, for recrimination, for "I told you so." Instead, he said the words she'd needed to hear for 4 years. "Come home, sweetheart. I've got a room ready for you. I've always had a room ready." Ryan, her brother, became her co-conspirator. He was 32 now, the COO of Mercer Construction, and he approached the extraction with military precision. He didn't waste time on recriminations or questions about why she hadn't called sooner. He just got to work. He connected her with Patricia Okonkwo, a divorce attorney in New York, who specialized in high asset separations and clients escaping controlling spouses. Patricia had handled cases involving Fortune 500 executives, Saudi princes, and a tech billionaire whose wife had lived under surveillance for 6 years. She understood exactly what Layla was facing. They couldn't meet in person. Dominic tracked her phone, her car, her credit cards. So they communicated through the burner phone, through coded messages, through a secure email account Ryan had set up. Patricia explained what Layla needed to know. The prenup had a cheating clause. Dominic's affairs meant she could take him for everything. Combined with evidence of his abuse and his crimes, she'd win big. But they needed proof of everything. Layla spent 3 days photographing every file in Dominic's study. She worked in short bursts, 20 minutes here, 15 minutes there, always listening for Rosa's footsteps, always ready with an excuse about looking for aspirin or checking the thermostat. She photographed bank statements, property deeds, investment portfolios, corporate filings. She documented every asset he'd hidden from her, every account with only his name, every lie he'd told about their supposedly shared finances. She photographed the corruption evidence, too. Every bribe related to the Atlanta project, every communication between Dominic and Vanessa about destroying her father's bid, every piece of the puzzle that would bring them both down. On day 4, Ryan drove to New York and waited in a parking garage 3 blocks from the penthouse. Layla walked there during her approved afternoon outing, a prenatal yoga class she'd been attending for months. She handed him a thumb drive containing everything. He handed her a new identity. A bank account in her maiden name at a credit union in Charleston, already funded with $50,000 from their father. A prepaid phone with no GPS tracking. a folder containing copies of her birth certificate, social security card, and passport, documents she hadn't seen in years, documents Dominic had locked in his safe. Ryan had gotten them from their father's attorney, who had quietly requested duplicates from the relevant agencies months ago. Henry had been preparing for this day since the moment Layla stopped returning his calls. On day 5, at 3 a.m., Layla packed one suitcase. She moved through the penthouse silently, selecting only what had been hers before Dominic. Comfortable clothes, her diploma from Columbia, photos of her mother, a bracelet her grandmother had given her, the ultrasound images of her daughter. She left behind the designer clothes, the jewelry, the shoes that cost more than some people's rent. She left behind the woman Dominic had tried to create, the hollow, beautiful shell with no voice and no will and no future. She left behind the ring, 3 carats, flawless, worth more than her father's first house. She placed it on the kitchen island, alone, where it would catch the morning light. She didn't leave a note. He didn't deserve an explanation. At 3:47 a.m., Ryan's car was waiting at the service entrance. She climbed into the back seat with her single suitcase, her hand resting on her belly. The baby kicked, a strong kick, a fighting kick. The Manhattan skyline glittered in the rear-view mirror as they crossed the bridge. By the time Dominic's plane landed at JFK, she was already in Virginia. By the time he walked into the penthouse and found the ring, she was in her father's arms, sobbing into his shoulder, finally safe. By the time he understood what had happened, it was already too late. Dominic Ashford arrived home at 6:15 p.m. on a Sunday evening, still glowing from 5 days with Vanessa. The Aspen trip had been everything he needed: crisp mountain air, expensive wine, powder so perfect it felt like skiing through clouds, and Vanessa, ambitious, uncomplicated Vanessa, who understood that powerful men had appetites and expectations. They'd finalized the strategy for the Atlanta project over champagne in the hot tub. They'd celebrated their inevitable victory with a dinner that cost more than most people's monthly rent. They'd made plans for the future, a future that would begin as soon as Dominic dealt with the inconvenience of his pregnant wife. He'd file for divorce after the baby was born, he'd decided. Claim Layla was mentally unstable, emotionally erratic, unfit for custody. Vanessa had already drafted the legal strategy. They'd use her pregnancy hormones against her, paint her as hysterical and paranoid, get full custody of the child, and minimal settlement. It would be clean, efficient, profitable. He dropped his Louis Vuitton luggage in the foyer and called out, "Layla, I'm home." Silence. The penthouse was dark. No lights in the living room, no music playing softly from the speakers, no smell of dinner cooking. "Layla?" He walked through the living room, checking the couch where she sometimes read. Empty. The dining room. Empty. The kitchen. That's when he saw it. Her wedding ring, sitting on the marble island like an accusation, 3 carats catching the last light of sunset, cold and sharp and utterly alone. His hand trembled as he picked it up. He checked the bedroom. Her side of the closet was half empty. Not the designer clothes, those were still there, but the comfortable things, the yoga pants, the cotton sweaters, the items she'd brought from her old life. Her toiletries were gone from the bathroom. Her laptop was missing from the study. The overnight bag she kept in the guest closet had vanished. He called her phone, straight to voicemail. No personalized greeting, just a generic automated message. He called again and again, 6 times, 7. He called Rosa. She hadn't seen Mrs. Ashford since Friday morning. She'd assumed Layla had a doctor's appointment. Mrs. Ashford had seemed tired lately, hadn't been eating well, had spent a lot of time resting. He called Elena, same answer. Mrs. Ashford had cleared her schedule for the week, but hadn't explained why. Elena had assumed it was pregnancy-related. He called the building's concierge, the doormen, the parking garage attendants. No one had seen her leave. No one had noticed anything unusual. She had vanished. Dominic poured himself a scotch with shaking hands and tried to think. This wasn't possible. She had no money. She had no resources. She had no connections outside of the life he'd built for her.
He had spent 4 years carefully removing every escape route, every support system, every possibility of independence. Where could she possibly go? Then it hit him. Her father. He grabbed his phone and dialed Mercer Construction's main office. A receptionist answered. He disguised his voice, claimed to be a potential investor, asked to speak with Henry Mercer. "Mr. Mercer is unavailable," the receptionist said. "He's dealing with a family matter. Can I take a message?" Dominic hung up without answering. He knew where she'd gone, and he knew, with a cold certainty that settled into his stomach like lead, that she hadn't gone empty-handed. His study. He ran to the door, punched in the code with shaking fingers, burst into the room. Everything looked normal at first glance. The files were in their places. The documents were stacked neatly. Nothing was missing. But something was wrong. He could feel it. The alignment of things was slightly off. Papers that should have been at perfect right angles were fractionally askew. A drawer that he always pushed in completely was open by half an inch. He pulled out the Atlanta files. They were all there. Every document, every email, every piece of incriminating evidence. But he noticed something else. A faint pattern on the dust on his desk. Rectangular outlines. The ghost of papers that had been removed, photographed, and replaced. Someone had been here. Someone had looked through everything. Someone had documented every piece of corruption he'd spent years accumulating. Layla. Stupid, silent, broken Layla. The wife he'd dismissed as decoration. The woman he'd told himself had no spine, no cunning, no capacity for strategy. The accessory he'd expected to smile and comply until he decided to discard her. She'd been playing him. For weeks, maybe months. She'd watched and waited and planned, memorizing codes and schedules and habits, and he'd never suspected, because he'd never thought she was capable. He'd underestimated her, the same way he'd underestimated her father. An hour later, everything fell apart. His phone rang. His attorney. His real attorney, not Vanessa. "Have you seen the news?" Dominic turned on the television. His own face stared back at him. Real estate mogul under federal investigation for bribery scheme. The headline crawled across the bottom of the screen while a reporter stood outside his building, describing anonymous tips received by the FBI and the Atlanta City Ethics Board. Bank records, email communications, detailed evidence of corruption spanning multiple projects and multiple years. Ashford Development's stock price was already crashing. Partners were issuing statements of distance. Investors were demanding meetings. His phone started ringing. It didn't stop for hours. Business partners called to express concern and to quietly distance themselves. Investors demanded emergency meetings. His personal attorney suggested they talk about protecting his remaining assets. His publicist resigned via text message. By nightfall, he'd aged 10 years. Vanessa lasted exactly 72 hours. She'd been confident at first. In the hours after the news broke, she'd called Dominic to strategize.
They'd weathered scandals before, she reminded him. This was manageable. The key was to stay calm, hire the right attorneys, and let the media cycle move on to something else. But when federal agents arrived at her office with subpoenas, not requests, subpoenas, something changed. The lead agent was a woman named Torres, mid-40s, gray at her temples, the kind of face that had seen every lie and believed none of them. She laid out the evidence they already had: bank records, emails, testimony from a city official who'd decided to cooperate. Then she explained Vanessa's options. She could go down with Dominic and spend decades in prison, or she could tell them everything and walk free. Vanessa chose herself, like she always had. She gave them everything. Names, dates, amounts. She explained how they'd been stealing contracts for years, bribing officials, planting fake evidence, destroying competitors. She told them about Miami, about Atlanta, about a dozen other cities where Dominic had cheated his way to the top. And she blamed all of it on him. She cried on cue. She played the victim perfectly. The partnership that had seemed so powerful collapsed like a house of cards in a windstorm. Dominic was arrested on a Thursday afternoon. The cameras caught everything, him being led from the lobby of his own building, the building with his name on it, the building he'd constructed as a monument to his success. Hands behind his back, federal agent on each arm, face pale, stunned, slack with disbelief. He looked like a man who'd never imagined consequences could apply to him. He made bail, but it didn't matter. His company's stock was worthless. His investors had fled. His properties were frozen pending investigation. His name was poison. The penthouse that had once hosted senators and celebrities now felt like a mausoleum. Rosa had quit. Elena had quit. Even the doorman avoided eye contact when Dominic walked through the lobby. 3 days after his arrest, he called Layla. He'd spent those 3 days trying to reach her through official channels. Her attorney blocked every attempt. Her father's company refused his calls. He'd hired a private investigator who'd traced her to Charleston, but couldn't get past the security Henry Mercer had installed. Finally, desperate, he'd found an old friend of hers from architecture school, someone he'd never met, someone who barely remembered Layla. He'd paid her $2,000 for a phone number that might or might not work. He called from his attorney's phone, using a number she wouldn't recognize. She answered. Layla. His voice was hoarse, broken, the voice of a man who'd lost everything and couldn't understand why the universe had turned against him. Layla, please, I need to see you. I need to talk to you. I can explain everything. This is all a misunderstanding. You don't understand what really happened. I understand perfectly. Her voice was calm, steady, unrecognizable from the woman who'd once cried in his bathroom after he'd dismissed her work as a hobby. The woman who'd once flinched at his displeasure. The woman who'd once believed she was nothing without him. This woman was someone new, someone he'd never met, someone he'd never bothered to see. You did this to me, he said. You destroyed me, everything I built. I didn't destroy you, Dominic. You destroyed yourself. You've been destroying yourself for decades. I just stopped being part of it. I loved you. I gave you everything, the penthouse, the clothes, the life. I made you somebody. You made me a prisoner. Her voice didn't waver. And I'm not talking about this anymore. Layla, please. His voice cracked. Come back. We can fix this. We can be a family. The baby needs a father. I need you. I'll change. I'll be different. Just give me a chance. There was a long pause, long enough that he thought she might be considering it. Then she said 2 words, "Goodbye, Dominic." The line went dead. He threw the phone across the room. It shattered against the wall of his empty penthouse. But he wasn't done. Men like Dominic never accept defeat quietly. 6 months later, Charlotte Grace Mercer was born in a private room at the Medical University of South Carolina. She came into the world at 3:47 a.m., the same time her mother had walked out of the penthouse, screaming with healthy lungs and grasping fingers. She had Layla's dark hair and Henry's stubborn chin, and eyes that would eventually settle into a color no one could quite identify. When Henry held his granddaughter for the first time, he cried. Layla had never seen her father cry, not at her mother's funeral, not during the years of struggle, not even when she'd called him from New York and told him she was coming home. But he cried now, this strong man who'd built an empire with his hands, holding a 7-pound baby in arms that could pour concrete and frame walls and carry the weight of everything he'd ever loved. The months after Layla's return had been a slow rebuilding. She lived in her father's Charleston house, in the room he'd kept ready for 4 years. The walls were still the pale blue she'd chosen as a teenager. Her bookshelves still held her college textbooks. Her mother's quilt was folded at the foot of the bed, preserved like a promise. She ate dinners with her family every night. Real dinners, where people laughed and argued and passed dishes without monitoring anyone's portions. She played with her nieces and nephews in the backyard, getting grass stains on clothes that nobody criticized. She walked through the garden her mother had planted decades ago, the roses, the hydrangeas, the jasmine that bloomed every spring, which Henry had maintained like a sacred trust. She started working again, small projects at first, consulting on materials, reviewing blueprints, offering suggestions that people actually listened to. Then larger ones, a boutique hotel in Savannah that was featured in Architectural Digest, a community center in Atlanta that won an award for sustainable design, a mixed-income housing development that used the principles she'd once tried to explain at a dinner party in the Hamptons before her husband squeezed her knee hard enough to bruise. Her name appeared on the project now, her actual name, Layla Mercer, not Mrs. Dominic Ashford, her signature, her vision. She went to therapy every Tuesday with a woman named Dr. Chen, who never told her what to feel. She learned words for what had happened to her: coercive control, financial abuse, isolation tactics, gaslighting. She learned that leaving wasn't weakness, but the hardest kind of strength, that asking for help wasn't failure, but wisdom, that starting over at 32 wasn't too late for anything. She slept through the night now, most nights, and when the nightmares came, when she dreamed of marble counters and designer clothes and a voice telling her she was worthless, she knew how to wake herself up. She knew the dreams weren't true. The trial happened while she was pregnant. Layla didn't attend. She didn't need to. She'd already given her testimony to federal prosecutors, already provided every document and photograph and piece of evidence they needed. She watched the highlights on the news, curled up on her father's couch with a cup of decaf tea, and felt remarkably little. The prosecution called 47 witnesses, former employees who'd been pressured to falsify documents, city officials who'd accepted bribes and now sought to reduce their own sentences, business partners who'd been threatened into silence for years, and Vanessa. Vanessa took the stand for 3 days, describing their schemes in meticulous detail, dabbing her eyes for the cameras whenever the questioning got intense. She played the victim perfectly, the brilliant attorney manipulated by a powerful man, coerced into crimes she never would have committed on her own, The jury didn't believe her entirely, but they believed her enough. Dominic was convicted on 7 federal counts: bribery, fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, racketeering. The evidence was overwhelming. The testimony was damning. His own lawyers could only argue for leniency, not innocence. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. His assets were seized, his company dissolved. His name became shorthand for corruption and downfall, a cautionary tale they'd teach in business schools for decades. He would be 61 when he got out, an old man with nothing but time to think about everything he'd lost. But he tried one last time. 3 months after Charlotte was born, Dominic appeared at her father's house. He'd been released on bail pending appeal, and he'd driven all the way to Charleston with gifts and tears and promises. He stood on the porch in a suit that no longer fit quite right. He'd lost weight, lost color, lost the glossy confidence that had once made him seem invincible. He carried a teddy bear and a jewelry box and a photo album he'd assembled himself. He begged for a chance to meet his daughter. He swore he'd changed. Prison had given him perspective. He understood now what really mattered. Layla almost believed him. She watched him hold Charlotte for 20 minutes in her father's living room, surrounded by family, surrounded by witnesses. He seemed genuine, tender, different from the man she'd married. Then Ryan pulled her into the kitchen. "He's wearing a wire," Ryan said quietly. His jaw was tight with anger. His lawyer filed a motion yesterday, claiming parental alienation, claiming you've poisoned him against his own child. He needs evidence of you being hostile, refusing access, denying him his rights. Layla looked through the kitchen doorway at Dominic, who was smiling and cooing at the baby like a devoted father. The same smile he'd used on her once, the same performance. She walked back into the living room, lifted Charlotte from his arms, and told him to leave.
His mask slipped, just for a second. The old Dominic surfaced. The cold eyes, the cruel smile, the contempt he'd hidden so carefully.
"You'll regret this," he said. "I'll make sure you regret this."
No. She held her daughter close, her voice steady. "I don't think I will." She handed the security footage to Patricia. The recording showed everything. Dominic adjusting the wire in the driveway, coaching himself on what to say, telling his attorney on the phone that he just needed to get her to refuse him once on tape. The judge reviewed the evidence and terminated his parental rights entirely. Dominic Ashford would never see his daughter again. Last Layla heard, he was working in the prison library, filing paperwork, sorting books, a far cry from the Manhattan penthouse where he'd once held court over the city. She didn't think about him much anymore. He was a closed chapter, a lesson learned, a cautionary tale she might tell Charlotte someday, when her daughter was old enough to understand. On an evening in late September, Layla sat on her father's porch with Charlotte in her arms. The sun was setting over the harbor, painting the water in shades of gold and rose. Spanish moss hung from the oak trees like curtains. Somewhere nearby, a neighbor was grilling, and the smell of charcoal drifted on the warm air. Henry came out with 2 glasses of sweet tea and settled into the rocking chair beside her. They didn't speak for a long time. They didn't need to. Charlotte had fallen asleep, her small hand curled around Layla's finger. The sky deepened from gold to amber to the first hint of purple. Finally, Henry reached over and squeezed his daughter's hand. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart." Layla looked at her daughter, then at her father, then at the horizon stretching endlessly before them. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She was home. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories. See you next time.